Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Dorothy O'Byrne here from CCMA. Delighted to welcome you to our webinar this afternoon. On screen, you'll see Dr. Nicola Millard, our guest speaker today, who we're obviously delighted to welcome once again to speak to the CCMA membership, and Niamh Doherty of WSI, who's supplying, as always, our technical support for this event. So I can see people logging in furiously, and we're delighted to see you joining. So as always, we're just going to give it a couple of minutes to get everybody set up. And the webinar is for half an hour. We are recording it. I think, Nicola, you're happy to share a version of the presentation afterwards. And I know, ladies and gentlemen, we have a treat in store, because I've seen this presentation, and I was saying to Nicola, I think there's some really interesting insights and very useful data for everybody here. And I know Nicola said she thinks that while she's given this presentation, it might get a bit contentious towards the end of it. So we really do, as always, encourage you to send in any questions that you have, any observations and comments, and I'll put them to Nicola at the end. So at around 25 past, I think, Nicola, we'll have time, and we go over the half hour. Hopefully those of you who are on that can stay will stay. But please, can I encourage you to send through, as I say, your comments or questions, because we really want to make this as interactive as possible, and we do really think there's some valuable insights for all of us in the industry. And I know, Nicola, we were talking just before we went live about the fact that unfortunately there's no Irish data here, but maybe in the future there will be. But I still think a lot of the data that's presented will be very beneficial for people to see. So it's 2 minutes past the hour. I'm going to stop talking and hand over to you, Nicola, and say thanks again, as always, and really looking forward to the presentation.
Thank you, Dorothy, as always. So yes, there's no Irish data here. I hope we do some at some point, because it would be very interesting. But for those of you who don't know me, where have you been? I mean, honestly, and no, I've been around a while. My name is Nicola. I did used to be a futurologist. I got really, really tired of the crystal ball jokes. So yes, I am a principal innovation partner. Now, that means it's a boring job title, but it's not a boring job. So bit of background, I have been with BT for a very long time. I am part of BT's innovation team. I am actually based in the east of England, in Ipswich, and normally I would be at Adastral Park, which is our main research and innovation headquarters, which is about 7 miles away from where I am actually standing, which is my kitchen, for obvious reasons. I'm basically firstly the data geek in the team. Secondly, I am obsessed with contact centers. So my PhD was on contact centers. I am that sad. And I am also the psychologist in the team. So I do the people bit. So this is all about trying to understand behaviors. And for those of you who've seen this before, because Dorothy was kind enough to invite me last year to present the data that we had last year about autonomous customers, this is the new autonomous customer. So for those of you who haven't seen this before, this is a piece of research that we've been doing for a very long time, actually. We started off in 2010, and we started off relatively modestly. So typically what we try and do is take a sample of 500 customers. We try and make sure that they're across the normal, a representative sample within the country. We started off with just 1,000 customers across the US and the UK. We got more ambitious, and actually on our 10th anniversary edition, which we published February last year, we had done a bumper 12 countries. And then, of course, we've had a bit of a weird year, haven't we? So normally we would do this research every other year. So this is a year early. I keep saying it's an extraordinary piece of research for kind of an extraordinary year. So we've done 10 countries around the world, the usual 500 per country. We've also unusually asked agents this year how their year went. So we've asked 300 agents in India, the US and the UK, how they've made the transition during the pandemic. So I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of the data. Those of you who are interested in the full version, we do have a white paper, which we are very happy to share as well. So let's have a look. So I think, if you'd seen me speak this time last year, well, maybe just before this time last year, I doubt any of us would have predicted that our lives would have changed. So there are an awful lot of things that have changed during this year. We are indeed, video chatting obsessively with friends and family and colleagues and all of that lovely stuff. We are doing a lot more in the digital space, shopping, banking, all of that lovely stuff, because we can't do it in physical spaces anymore. And of course, those of us lucky enough to work from home have indeed embraced home working. I think our big question this year was, has that fundamentally changed customers' perceptions of what they want from customer experiences? And indeed, how has that impacted the contact center? And that's the reason why we've done the research, frankly. So the first thing to say is actually on the customer side, well, it's plus ça change, plus ça la même chose. My French is very bad, but basically, I think not a lot has changed. Although a lot has changed, not a lot has changed from the customer perception perspective. So in terms of delivery of customer service, we want great customer service. We want, one of the ones that's gone up a bit is this perception of, I want things to be easy. And we are getting a much, much bigger hike in people saying that I'm finding dealing with service issues exhausting. Now, I think that is the pandemic showing itself on some of the customer behaviours we're seeing, because frankly, we are already quite stressed. We're already having to manage all sorts of weird and wonderful things, from homeschooling to home working to blurring of work and home and all of that lovely stuff. So we don't want organisations adding to that stress. We are certainly getting a little bit of a shift around convenience being more important than price. That always kind of ebbs and flows in the research, but again, a shift to, can I get it, locally? Can I get it online rather than, going somewhere to get it? I think, that online digital piece is really important, and it's also important to get it right, and we'll see some of the consequences maybe of not getting it right as we go along. But I mean, some of the disturbing stuff, 82% are still saying that they're struggling to do the basics on digital customer experience. So stuff like paying for things or changing appointments are not necessarily as intuitive as they should be. And that's often where the contact center does have to leap in to pick up the pieces. So I would say, there have been a few shifts because of the pandemic, but overall, I would say we're not seeing a massive amount of change in terms of people's perceptions of customer experience. I think people were a little bit maybe more forgiving at the very beginning of the pandemic around customer experiences, but certainly, not a lot has changed since the pandemic hit after that forgiveness period. Those of you who know me will know I like graphs. This graph makes me unreasonably excited. This is UK data, and because we've always done the UK and the US, they're for the past 10 years, I've been able to compare and contrast certain trends. So this is a question we always ask, which is, when you want to contact an organisation, what channel do you use? Now, I've always found this fascinating because we have yet to see a rip and replace. We're not seeing one channel dominating. We're not seeing one channel replacing another channel. So the big news here is, the more channels you add, the more channels customers use. It has to be said that, we saw some weird stuff going on in the previous iteration of the research, largely because the digital customer experience was failing. So we saw a sudden spike in the use of the phone last year. Not continued. Having said that, it's still top in terms of when you've got a problem, you may well have tried to solve it online. Actually, the phone is still one of those areas where we do lift it up. It's very convenient, it's very easy, and we hope we're going to get an answer from the contact center. So the older channels are still dominating. We are seeing some sort of ebbs and flows. I think apps have been an interesting one this year, and we're seeing evidence that because we're not out and about, we're not necessarily using our mobile phones quite as much. So if we're using things, we're often on a tablet or a PC because we're largely at home. So apps, that usage has fallen somewhat. And we've also seen sort of ebbs and flows in things like chat as well. And I'll talk about chat in a minute. So yeah, some fascinating stuff going on in terms of channel choices, but it is a strategy as to how many channels you open up, because the more channels you open, the more complex you have to manage things across the omni-channel rather than just the one. People who've seen me speak before will also know that I say that our channel choices are largely dictated not by our age or our demographic, but what we want to do. So the first thing is, we're still getting this goal and intention state bias towards channel choice. So we've identified 3 types of customers in terms of goal and intention state. We've identified positive ones, negative ones, and neutral ones. Positive ones we call visionary customers. In other words, they are doing things they want to do. Normally, I would say things like getting married or planning a holiday. We haven't quite been able to do those kind of things. Maybe doing house improvements would be the better one as a pandemic example. But we're willing to invest time, energy, and effort in researching stuff. We might get a bit paranoid, we might need a bit of advice, but largely visionary customers are not that problematic. They will use multiple channels. They may need a bit of advice sometimes, but as long as you don't confuse them, they're fine. The trouble is if you confuse them or they can't get what they want, they flip into a very different type of customer. So we call these customers in crisis. We could start there as well. We've all been there, you know, got frustrated or angry. They are typically not that omni-channel. In fact, at extremes of anger and frustration, it's always the phone that gets picked up. And by the way, that includes the younger demographic as well, who allegedly never use the phone. Well, they don't until there's a crisis, frankly. So that's very much where the phone channel is picking up the slack. And they're very difficult customers to deal with because they generally do need the human touch, and you can't necessarily deflect. You can sometimes deflect them onto automated things, but not so easy to do digital with a customer in crisis. Then we've got the utilitarians, where digital works brilliantly if it's easy, because frankly, these are just transactional tasks, paying bills. I used to say buying carrots. I haven't bought carrots for a while, but you know, they're neutral tasks. I don't need a wow experience. I just need it to be quick and I need it to be easy. And again, if you've seen me before, you will know that we have done lots and lots of customer journeys based on these three things. So we can start to drop out what channels should we maybe signpost the customer for if we can figure out whether they are in a positive, negative or neutral state. So that still applies. I think in terms of the phone, it's, I mean, we asked the question, you know, why do you think the phone is the most effective channel? And, you know, there are perceptions that sometimes it's faster than trying to do it online, that the human touch is very much valued. So I think, you know, don't write the phone off. It is taking up some of the emotive and complex stuff, and that has got a massive impact on your agents. More on that towards the end. But I think, you know, chat still with me is a channel that I think is interesting. It's had its ebbs and flows. I think if you're looking at synchronous chat, traditionally web chat, you know, when you've got supposedly a real-time dialogue with an agent, sometimes that is not a great experience because we know that agents are often on maybe 3 simultaneous chat sessions. So it becomes a bit stulted. So I think we're seeing in terms of attitudes, maybe a few more problems from the customer experience side for the synchronous chat, but we are seeing asynchronous chat grow. Now, it depends which country you are in, but certainly countries like Brazil and a lot of the Asian countries that we've been looking at, WhatsApp has started to dominate. We tend to follow a little bit in Western countries, so that it's growing in Western countries, but because it's asynchronous, we can do it on our own time, but it's not email. I think that's an interesting experience. So I always say with chat, I think there's a lot of room for growth, with the proviso that it's got to be a good experience for customers to use it. And of course, that's linked in with one of the things I deal with a lot in the innovation space. In fact, I'm doing a session on this afternoon, right after this, which is around chatbots. Now, less hype, I think, around chatbots at the moment. I think there were a lot implemented towards the very beginning of the pandemic to try and take some of the pressure off the actual human agents who were often in transition between an office and home at the time. But I think, again, the experience of bots has not been necessarily as positive as it should be. Now, don't get me wrong, I think there are some awesome bots out there. I think the problem is that they have to be deployed at the right point in the customer journey, and they can't promise everything. I think a bot that says, tell me what you need, is a very difficult bot to effectively implement from a customer experience perspective. That's why I've called this IVR for digital, because I'm seeing some very big parallels with the deployment, the early deployment of IVR, and when we got lost in those press 1s and press 2s and stuck in infinite loops. That's often what's happening in the chatbot arena. So I do think they can be deployed very effectively, but firstly, they need to be probably narrow and deep bots, so only doing a certain element of the customer service journey that's very well defined, that has a lot of data and process associated with it. and it has to be in the appropriate place. So don't necessarily put it in complaints, for example, which tend to be a little bit more emotive, maybe something a little bit more utilitarian and transactional. Bots actually do play quite strongly. The one area that seems to have grown, unsurprisingly, to be honest, is video. Now I think this is quite interesting data, because we're getting 85% of customers saying, I'd quite like to use video chat to contact organizations. Now, my feeling is that's probably because suddenly video has become cool and we're all using it. And yes, there is video fatigue out there, absolutely no doubt. But whether that's actually true, that I want to, every time I contact an organization for whatever, I want to use video, I suspect is not true. I think we're still seeing growth in certain niche areas. The biggest one at the moment, understandably, is in health and Medicare, simply because we cannot get the face-to-face that we would ideally like. We're seeing growth in financial services. We're seeing growth in things like diagnostics. Certainly BT has been using it with our customers to do things like broadband diagnostics. So we have a very clever innovation app that, with the customer's permission, we can actually take control of the camera and the light on their smartphone and say, well, can you show me what you've got plugged in? So those kind of remote diagnostics have been brilliant for the pandemic, because we haven't had to send an engineer out, and actually we can hopefully solve the problem rather than the customer having to wait for 2 weeks, and that makes the experience a lot easier. So we're getting fantastic net easy scores and net promoter scores out of that. So I think video is interesting. I think we can engage on different levels with customers on video. I just don't think it's a panacea. We've had a lot of conversation about security as well. So, I mean, I think I'm getting about 3 or 4 hoax and phishing attacks on myself, you know, by multiple things every day, pretty much at the moment. So I think the anxiety there is, we know that there's a lot of security breaches going on. But again, we need security to be easy. And I've always said in the past that remembering 300 different passwords is not something my little brain is good at doing, particularly during a pandemic when my brain is semi-functional at best. So can we use things like biometrics, whether that's voice or a bit of my body, to help verify who I am, so that I can be certain that when I am dealing with an organization, I have done the right verification and the security is good, rather than me being paranoid that I'm going to be a victim of fraud. And then finally, on the customer side, I think that we've got, I talk a lot about this future trend that I call the me economy. So about trading my data for, firstly, a more personalized experience. Secondly, I think a really interesting area is proactivity. And I think this is where AI and chatbots can really come in very powerfully. So if we know something about the customer, can we send them the right message on the right channel at the right time? Now, there is an appetite for this. Admittedly, the figures are going down a little bit, because I think there are a lot of organizations trying to be more proactive with customers at the moment, but aren't necessarily getting the right message from the right channel at the right time. I think we're working with a number of innovation organizations at the moment to try and use AI and machine learning to try and get that better, because there's nothing worse than someone chasing you down the street and tapping you on a shoulder going, hey, would you be interested in? I always say, you know, if somebody does that to me multiple times, I'm going to punch them. We get the same in proactivity. So I'm just going to turn the proactive piece off. I'm going to turn my data off. I'm not going to let you have my data. That means all of the AI and machine learning does not work. So we've got to make sure we've got the right message at the right time. The lovely thing about chatbots in proactive is it's not ask me anything. You're maybe sending me a message saying, did you know that you have an appointment with an engineer who's coming out tomorrow at X amount of time? Can you still make the appointment? You've instantly set a conversation that's actually probably going to be a very narrow conversation, and that bots can actually deal with. But I think the challenge then is, if the bot fails, it needs to be able to route to an agent. You need to transfer the conversation across so that there's a seamless experience. So that's where a good customer experience comes from. And of course, we can start to get predictive as well. That can get creepy. And again, if you get creepy with customers, they're probably going to say, no, you can't have my data. So I think this is a big one when we get into the realm of smart everything and the Internet of Things. But we need to get that experience right. So that's the customer side. I'm going to touch on the agent side now. Now, I have to say, from a customer perspective, when we asked about whether they felt that contact centres had coped during the pandemic, largely we got a fairly positive picture. Generally, you know, I think contact centres have very much risen to the occasion. But what's the agent experience look like? Now, as I said, we asked agents in 3 countries, India, the US, and the UK. And I think, firstly, agents have realized how valuable they are for a start. So they are becoming, if you like, an emergency service. They're frontline, they're doing a job, they're supporting people during the pandemic. They are realizing their value. Having said that, they are getting quite a lot of complex stuff. They are noticing that questions are getting more complex during the pandemic. And as a result of that complexity, about 1/3 of them have had to seek advice either from a colleague or their team leader to actually resolve the contact. Now, the problem then is, of course, if they are working from home, they cannot spin their chair around and scream across the contact center floor, "Does anyone know about this?" They have to do that in the digital realm and hope that somebody actually picks it up. So that's why things like collaboration, I think, has become very important during the pandemic. I think one of the more interesting things that we found is the extent to which customers are doing other stuff when they're online with the contact center. Now, to be honest, we kind of knew this, but it's almost shocking that a lot of customers are, you know, cooking dinner or driving or playing games or reading or surfing whilst they are online with the agent. So although they have 100% of the agent's attention, the customer's often multitasking. And the problem with multitasking with complex stuff is you don't take it in. So one of the things I think it's exposed from an innovation perspective is how on those complex conversations we then follow up with the customer to confirm that they actually do have the information that the agent may well have told them very effectively, but they just weren't listening. So how do we maybe follow up with again, a proactive message on the right channel and at the right time? So that's the challenge, more difficult job to do. I think obviously the other thing is that they've had, some of them at least, have been uprooted from a largely office-based job to a non-office-based job. And of course, they, like all of the rest of us, are caught in a pandemic, and often customers are not necessarily as good to them as they should be. But I would say this is the contentious bit that Dorothy mentioned earlier. We are seeing some profoundly different answers between India, the UK, and the US. Now, it could be a timing problem. Admittedly, when we did this survey, most of the UK was still in lockdown, as we of course are now as well. So it could be a bit of lockdown fatigue going on. But I would say, disturbingly, we're finding in the UK, colleague satisfaction is pretty low. They have been more anxious. They don't feel quite as supported. And interestingly, turnover is low, which is usually the case in a down economy. So yes, they're stuck in a job they don't like, is the message here. Now, I think, again, the pandemic has taught us that particularly things like team leadership, and I think I talked about this in one of the previous calls I did for Dorothy, that team leadership is quite difficult when you have a remote team. And I think one of the things that we need to look at very carefully as we emerge into probably what is a hybrid work situation is to help the team leaders and managers manage teams better remotely. So things like anxiety, how do we actually make sure that we recognize mental health problems and help people, even if you can't see them physically in the contact center? And of course, we've had some feedback about the technologies that are being used. Again, the UK comes quite low in terms of the technologies. And it's interesting because I suspect that Indian, UK and US agents are probably working largely on the same platforms because, you know, they're the big platforms typically. So, you know, there are some issues here that the UK guys are basically saying the technology is not good. Is that really the case, or is simply they've got a bit of lockdown anxiety? I don't know. We're still sort of, this is why it's an interesting one to discuss, frankly. We've had a few discussions on this particular one. Just finally on the agent stuff is around the work from home piece, which I think is particularly interesting. We are seeing wide variations on work from home between the US, the UK and India. The US has had the highest deployment, India the lowest. Largely, it's often a function of place. So do they have an appropriate place to work? If agents skew young, often they're living with their parents or in shared houses, so generally it becomes less possible for them to work from home. In India, there are lots of data security requirements and indeed not necessarily a great electricity supply or indeed connectivity layered on top of that. So that can inhibit, and I think has taken down the percentage of agents saying that they can or do work from home. Having said that, I think the cat's out of the bag with a lot of people now. So we've got 71% saying that they quite like when we emerge at some point, hopefully soon, blinking out of the pandemic, that 71% of them are saying that I quite like the choice to work from home, not necessarily 5 days a week, but at least occasionally. And obviously that comes with, I need an appropriate place to work, I need a secure place to work, and of course a comfortable chair. I think that's the biggest lesson I've learned, is that you really do need a comfy chair when you're working from home. So I think, generally I think we're going to come out with some kind of hybrid situation. We're actually hoping to do a piece of research maybe later on this year on where we think the hybrid environment in the contact centres, what's it going to look like, what do we need to think about, and indeed, how do we train our team leaders as well. So I think some really fascinating stuff around the agent experience that we can learn from here, and I'd be interested to hear actually your views on where you think Ireland is on that curve as well. I'm going to shut up now. So thank you for listening. As I said, we can share the research, we'll share the slides as well. So no problem if you are a data nerd and would like to maybe go through some of the graphs in more depth. I'm always very, very happy to share. So thank you for listening.
Thanks, Nicola. That was brilliant, really superb. There's so much data. I know people are probably bamboozled with all the data, but I think it's really important to see the customer and the employee perspective. So I suppose the first question, if you're somebody on the webinar now and you are planning for that hybrid model and reopening, and we're still in lockdown here in Ireland too, and will be for the next while at least, what do you think their priorities should be if there's going to be that hybrid, those basic things like people saying the IT equipment, the comfortable chair, like I would have assumed that was all sorted a year into this, but obviously it's not in some cases.
Yeah, I think, I had, we had a few customers that had raided their own stocks of comfy chairs and taken them around on vans and distributed them. But yeah, I think it's obvious that some of the basics haven't been resolved even fairly. We did the research in November last year, so that's fairly deep into the pandemic. I think hybrid working is an interesting one because most people are talking about this notion of flexible working largely, so it's not new. The concept of being in the office for 3 days a week and a home for 2 is not particularly revolutionary. I do think hybrid could be revolutionary though, because it's actually a completely new way of working in my book anyway. That I found the perfect. So a zodonk is a combination of zebra and donkey. It looks a little bit like a donkey with zebra socks, basically. But as a donk does not spend 3 days a week as a zebra and 2 days a week as a donkey. It's a completely different breed. And I think when we look at hybrid, it's a different breed of working, and it implies that it unpins me from where I physically work. I can work anywhere. It's my choice and my employer's choice to come together and decide where that place might be on a day-to-day basis. But I think it is all about choices, and we can't impose the one-size-fits-all situation. Some people have been really adaptive to home working, but as I said, if you're young, if you're in a shared house, if you've got kids and you're homeschooling, if you're an extrovert and like hugging people, it can be quite difficult to permanently work from home. So we need to offer, when we can, choices for people, and I think that will be, a fairly standard way of working as we hopefully come out of the pandemic at some point soon.
Great. And another question from Susan. Have you seen any good examples of innovation to support improving collaboration between teams?
Well, yeah, I think the first thing is that there are loads of collaboration tools out there. I think that it's not lack of tools that's the problem. I think it's sometimes the fact that different tools do different things well, and you end up using 5 or 6 different ones. So, generally what we're finding is that video is doing a lot of the kind of meeting type stuff. I think the problem is that we're probably all at the limit to video fatigue at the moment. It's not a problem with video, it's often a problem with meetings. And I think the higher up you get in an organizational hierarchy, the more I always say I get up with an impending sense of Zoom every day. So my diary is completely filled with 30 to 60-minute chunks of solid meeting for the whole day, and on video as well. And that's, again, that's an analog way of working taken to the digital space, and I'm not sure it works. And I think for things like team huddles at the beginning of the day and the end of the day works really well. Do I want to be on video all day? Not really. I think there are a lot of the asynchronous tools, so whether that's WhatsApp, even internal social media, and simply, you know, just chats, frankly, I think those tools are often picking up the I'm going to say the Slack, because that's a product as well, but Slack can be used too.
Eugene has made the observation, or has asked, would Nicola, would agree with Nicola that we have found that our first time resolution for email queries has dropped, and this we are putting down to more complex questions?
Yeah, I mean, typically we find with email, it is one of the ones where you get complexity because the customer generally is articulating the problem, and it's often very complex. We find on average with the more complex emails, you're generally doing, I call it a slow tennis match. So it's usually, you know, you hit the email in, you get one back, you hit another one in to clarify. So I've always said it is an example of asynchronous. It's probably not the most effective asynchronous tool. I think chat is better. But yeah, I mean, inevitably complexity does tend to come in on email. There's been a lot of debate around, you know, how costly is email? Is it the best way of doing customer experience? Having said that, we experimented in BT a while back. We actually turned email off for 3 months. The clue is we turned it back on after 3 months because customers wanted to email us, but we were trying to deflect them onto things like chat. And to a certain extent, we managed, but we didn't completely manage. And we try and, you know, point people to email when they do have that big complex thing that does require several sides of A4 to articulate. But yeah, inevitably it does end up with a lot more complexity and maybe a little bit more of that tennis match going on.
Last question, because I'm conscious of the time, Nicola. You talked about the different channels and about turning them on rather than turning them off, as you talk even there about your own experience with email. And I think to your point earlier that customers were more patient at the beginning of the pandemic, but they're less patient now. And, you know, we're a year into it, so companies should be set up. Have you any view, and it mightn't have come through in the research, whether companies should be set up that different agents support a specific channel rather than a range of channels? Is there any sort of insights as to, you know, multi-skilling agents or just having them dedicated to a channel, which is better?
I think there's obviously always been a debate about this, and I think it's very difficult to mix asynchronous and synchronous channels by the nature. So if you're you can't suddenly lob a chat in halfway through a telephone conversation. So I'd say it's more asynchronous, synchronous, and then probably verbal versus written. So I think agents could probably cover any channel, because I always say agents really should be just really good communicators and really good problem solvers. And actually, we can all cope with different channels. We probably have preferences. So agents always have preferences on the channels that they're using. But it is around preference. And again, if you've suddenly got a massive queue on one channel and nothing on another, you should be able to switch the agent without necessarily disturbing the kind of core skill set that they have. But yeah. I mean, it's all to do with strategy training and the confidence your agents have, I think, in terms of that. But I think it's more the fact that you can't blend synchronous and asynchronous together easily.
Yeah, and I think it also will link back to agents' engagement, because, you know, if it's a tedious, monotonous type task, the engagement levels will go down if they're continuously handling that type of work. Yeah,
and to be honest, the thing with automation is if it's done right, they shouldn't get the tedious stuff. They really shouldn't get the tedious stuff. The trouble is it's very clear coming from the data that we're not getting that triage bit right. So there is certainly a certain amount of utilitarian stuff that comes through, and particularly on chat, oddly enough, you know, when you open, you know, that sort of thing comes through frequently on chat and should be dealt with by a bot, really. That should never come through to a human agent. So I always say, you know, as you automate more, your agents are going to get the more interesting, meaty stuff. But that probably means they also need more help, which is why things like knowledge bases and actually bots to support the agents really come in as well, because we can't continuously update their brains, because otherwise they'd never be dealing with customers. So how do we use the technology to upskill and handhold them when they need to deal with that complexity?
And I think the last thing to say on that is, I know from all of the webinars we've been doing, you know, this whole idea of stepping into the customer's shoes. I think a lot of companies have stopped doing that, and therefore the whole journey mapping, you're also not getting teams being able to collaborate because they're not physically in the same space. And okay, you can do it virtually, but it's not necessarily the same. So companies do really need to take a step back now, and you know, the ones that aren't doing it right. Is there any company you'd put as an example of somebody who are doing it right, apart from BT, I'm sure, but is there anybody else you'd put up there?
I mean, we're sort of looking at it at the moment. I've always said with contact centers, there is a need for what I call communities of coping. And those communities of coping would normally kind of boil over in the physical contact center with people hugging each other. I think that's what, you know, has been missed. I actually did a webinar a few months ago with it was a pet food company, and they built a lot of fun into their day, and I think that's again something that maybe we've forgotten. You know, we've got very bogged down into, okay, we've got angry customers and queues, and oh my God, I'm working from home, I have no work-life balance. Actually, they built in a lot of fun activities. So they were having some quite interesting sort of virtual stand-ups and video calls, again, you know, just to try and lift people's spirits. Now, that was relatively early on in the pandemic. I hope they've continued doing it, because I think as we get into 4th, 5th, 6th lockdown, hopefully that won't happen. But, you know, I think we're seeing fatigue now, and particularly fatigue on the leaders. And I think the leadership bit is the very critical bit to get right, because they do, they're very key to motivating people. They're very key to keeping people, you know, on target in terms of purpose. And also maybe in terms of injecting a bit of fun into work as well. And I think we really do need to support leaders more than maybe we do.
Yeah, perfect, great. I'm conscious of time. I know we said we'd go a little bit over, and we've gone a few minutes over. Just as always, Nicola, just so refreshing. I know this is your 3rd webinar. Just to say to anybody on the webinar, if you go onto our resources page, you can access your previous webinars that are there. But I just think that's so insightful, and hopefully we will be able to put a copy of the presentation and a recording of the webinar hopefully up on the website tomorrow. But as always, thank you so much for your time. I know Rachel is there in the background, and Zoe and Rebecca and Elaine. So thank you to all of the BT Ireland team for helping set this up. And we really do appreciate your time, Nicola. And we hope to see you again before the end of the year, all going well.
Absolutely. And I'd love to come over physically at some point as well.
Oh,
that would be lovely.
That'd be great. Be absolutely great. Brilliant. Thanks again. Take care.
Bye-bye then.
Bye-bye.